Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, a podcast that generates $10,000 of attributed sales each and every month, meaning we're turning listeners into clients. I'm also the co-founder of the leading podcast and book brand under the pen name of Daniel Larson, with multiple best-selling books, having sold tens of thousands of copies over the years. So here are 50 podcasting growth tips in 36 minutes. Let's dive straight in. The best way to monetize your podcast is by selling your own stuff. Advertising or sponsorships suck when you're not getting millions of downloads on your podcast. The honest truth is, the average CPM, which means cost per 1,000 listeners essentially, is around an average $25, which is pretty crap. Which means, let's say you've gone through all of the hard work, and I'm going to do some quick maths here, and you're now getting, let's say, 1,000 downloads per episode. You can expect on average to get paid $25 for an advertising spot, which again isn't really that great. Whereas if you advertise your own stuff, either your program, an offer, an affiliate link, whatever you have to sell to your audience, you get way more of a payout. And the best part is your audience is selling directly to you. You're capturing that value because at the end of the day, an actual sponsor or an advert while leveraging you and using your podcast to get in front of your audience. So they themselves must be getting an ROI if they're spending money with you. And that's why I believe that you yourself, as an entrepreneur with a podcast, should prioritize promoting your own stuff. The formula for a truly unique show is weekly output plus specific targeting times unique concept. So let me explain. Look, at the end of the day, if you're in a competitive space, there's so many podcasts out there now. So the days where you could just upload the podcast, an interview-based style show, and hope your podcast is going to take off when you're competing against all the biggest names out there in the industry is very rare that you'll actually gain that traction. Unless you have something unique about your show. What's your unique twist? What makes your show completely different from every other show out there in your industry? And this right here, this formula right here, allows you to create a USP, a unique selling point. And how it works is a spectrum. So when it comes to weekly output, you want to increase your weekly output. A daily podcast is far more unique than a weekly show. Now, put your pistols down. I'm not saying to go for a daily show. I'm just simply suggesting that if you did have a daily show, that objectively speaking is a unique show, plus specific targeting. The more specific your show is, the more unique your podcast is, because there's going to be less people targeting the audience you want to reach. An example would be if you had a podcast that was just personal development. Okay, cool. But we can get more specific. Personal developments, specifically about anxiety. Okay, cool. But we could even get more specific, helping parents to deal with anxiety, overcome their problems. That could be way more specific because it's helping parents specifically. So let's say you had a daily show helping parents who suffer with anxiety. Now that's super specific. And then we have times unique concept. So what makes the show different? Like, how are you going to be differentiated in how you actually deliver the podcast? Is it interview based or is it maybe solo episodes? The point here is to have a unique concept. You want to look at other shows in your industry and ask yourself, what could I do differently? Whether that's you getting your listeners to hand you specific situations where the anxiety comes up, or maybe whether that's you breaking down bonkers self-care strategies to help your audience deal with anxiety. And that's the concept of your show. The point is, think about what's going to make you different. What's going to be the sticking point for your show versus everyone else. The best lead magnet are something that feels personalized that your listeners would happily pay for. The whole point here, again, think about your process. If you're an entrepreneur with a show or you have a coaching program, whatever it might be, if you're trying to get the email of your audience, you need to give them a good bribe. So something that they're willing and happy to pay for. It might be a part of your process. It might be a step that you particularly have. It might be a book that you have. Whatever that is, that should be your lead magnet and it should feel personalized to them. For us, we give our listeners a personalized podcast mini audit. In addition to that, we also give them an ebook copy of our best-selling book, Podcast Marketing. So for you, think about what that might be and make it personalized. Vague episode titles lead to slow growth and low engagement. If the audience you want to reach have no idea what your podcast is about, why they should listen or why they should care, or you're not clearly telling them the value of the show or making it super intriguing, your podcast will go ignored. So it's super important that you have clear, super specific titles or that have massive intrigue. Vague titles is a recipe for slow growth and low engagement. End episodes quickly to keep listeners engaged and moving on to the next episode. So for me, keep things short and snappy when you're giving your recap. Don't let it feel drawn out and draining, but make it exciting. Make it fun for yourself as well as your listeners, but also end in a snappy way. I like this because it leaves my audience wanting more. It's almost like I've gave them the cream of the crop. It's just the pinnacle. I'm giving the cream of the crop. I make sure my energy is completely perfect, and I rounded things off in a beautiful way that leaves them wanting more. Use clips from older episodes to retain listeners and attract new ones. So an easy trick you can do is go back to your past episodes that performed exceptionally well. Maybe it's an interview you did with a guest. Find a little, maybe like a 5-minute segment that you thought just blew your mind and you want to give a quick recap on. This is an excellent way of looking at past episodes that's performed well and leveraging it in present day in order to gain more traction, because you already know that that segment or that particular episode performed extremely well. So how do we leverage that even more in order to create better content for your audience? Share real life case studies to illustrate your expertise within solo episodes. This is such an easy way to attract the right listeners that you want, but also to nurture your current listeners, positioning yourself as an authority, someone of value that they can buy from. And having real life case studies is a great way to demonstrate your own expertise, as well as past client results if, again, you're using your podcast as a lead generation tool. Newsjacking is a great way to leverage current affairs to reach a new audience. Think about it. Newsjacking, essentially, what it means simply means is when something big or a massive news or current affairs goes on in the industry, you can piggyback off that because it's a hot and trending topic, which means there's going to be tons and tons and tons of search volume going for this particular keyword or the search term or this topic. Think about it. Back in 2020, when there was a massive boom when it came to crypto, all of the podcasts talking about crypto, guess what? Even if they were crap, even if they were terrible, they were still gaining so much traction because of newsjacking, because crypto was a hot and trending topic. So for you, ask yourself, in my industry right now, what's some hot and trending topics? How can I newsjack, uncover this specific topic in my podcast? Now, I'm not saying get on a content hamster wheel and become a slave to news, because then again, your podcast changes from evergreen content to now news. That wouldn't quite work. But I am saying when these specific opportunities come in the industry, take advantage of them. And you want to have the balance between relevant and timely content, and then of course your evergreen content to keep listeners in. Evergreen content to, again, keep listeners binging your content, and the timely content to leverage hot and trending topics that are going on right now. And you can use that to drive way more growth for your podcast. It's normal to have small and big dips in your podcast growth. That's when you should work even harder. So last year I went to a podcast conference and I interviewed a bunch of people who were absolute sharks in the industry. Some were getting 300,000 monthly downloads, others were getting 1 million plus. I interviewed a guy called Martin Hewlett, who was the actual host of a podcast called Calming Anxiety, which is one of the biggest podcasts on earth for people who suffer with anxiety. It's a huge show. And he mentioned that during his uprising, he was at a point where he was getting 360,000 monthly downloads. And he sometimes experienced drops of 50 to 60% in his monthly downloads. Imagine waking up and having 60% drop in your monthly download when you are at 300,000 monthly downloads. But he didn't give up. He didn't let that bog him down. He just said, you know what, look, this is an opportunity for me to improve my show, for me to double down on what's working. I really figure out how do I keep upgrading the show, because sometimes it just happens. Now for you, yours might not be, an 80% or 50% drop off, but you might have little drops along the way. That's your sign to really double down and work even harder. Asking guests to review your podcast after your recording session is an easy way to increase your reviewing. Don't think that quite makes sense. It's an easy way to increase the number of reviews you have on your podcast. Super simple. Start doing it way more. Make sure to always show appreciation for your current listeners. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a sucker when it comes to getting new listeners and growing the podcast. Of course, the whole point of your show is to keep your current listeners engaged, but also to reach a new audience. But never forget to always say thank you and appreciation for your audience you currently have, because they're the ones who are staying loyal to you, who are listening to your podcast week in and week out. So by showing them appreciation, you're encouraging them and creating a positive feedback loop where they're going to want to carry on listening to your podcast and watch you on your journey. Each new person that follows you on social media, reach out to them and ask if they would be interested in a show like yours. This is such an easy way to actually turn more strangers online into active listeners of your podcast. Just because you have a bunch of people following you on social media, it doesn't mean all of those people are listening to your podcast. So an easy way is just simply every single person who follows you or likes or engages with your content, reach out to them and just politely say, hey, by the way, I've got a podcast about X, Y, and Z. Here's a popular episode. Would you like me to share it with you? If you're not, that's totally cool. I totally get it. But at least this way, you're inviting every single person who comes into your ecosystem to actually engage with your podcast. Batch record episodes to always stay ahead of schedule. No one likes to be on a content hamster wheel, so having episodes that are batch recorded is such an easy way for you to stay ahead and to have way less stress, way less headache, and way more fun because, again, you're way ahead in terms of your schedule. Incorporate storytelling into your episodes to make them more compelling and way more engaging. Think about how to clearly communicate who your show is for through your show's name. If you're currently in a situation where you feel like you aren't attracting the right listeners to your podcast, maybe you're in a spot where you realize that a lot of the audience you're now currently attracting aren't the ideal listeners for your show. An easy way to fix this is by changing the name of your actual podcast. It's such an easy way. Think about it. It's like a billboard for who you want to attract. And we had a client recently whose podcast old name was called The Invested Teachers, but his target was for high net worth individuals, which didn't really make sense because he was actually attracting teachers because the show was called Invested Teacher. So we helped him pivot and rebrand the show, and his new name for the podcast was The Canadian Wealth Secrets, right? For high net worth individuals looking for tax and investment strategies. Such a simple shift in a name meant they were now attracting way more of the right listeners, and it can really be that simple. So clarify who your show's for to attract audience you want to reach. Actively seek and incorporate listener feedback to your show. This is such an easy way to improve your show constantly. If you're not getting feedback from your audience, how can you expect to improve your show on a consistent basis? If you're struggling when it comes to audience engagement, I'm sure there's one or two people who you know have listened to your show. Just ask for honest feedback. Or if someone leaves a review or emails you about your podcast, telling you how much they love it, ask them, hey, look, we're constantly trying to improve our podcast. Do you have any clue what we could do to improve the show for new listeners? 2 ways to get listeners' feedback, even if you have a small audience. Number 1, look at your most popular episodes. That will tell you which topics you cover on the podcast your audience absolutely love, because again, they're voting with their listen. So this is an easy way for you to see what topics do I cover that my audience absolutely love, and which topics should I maybe cover less so because they clearly don't love it. And then another way is by looking at your retention time, which isn't on here, but looking at your retention time tells you which episodes your audience enjoyed the most. Just because you get an episode that has 1,000 downloads on it, it doesn't mean that it was actually a good episode. It just means you might have covered a popular topic or did a great work when it comes to promoting. But if you look at your retention time, it tells you how engaging was the actual episode. The higher your retention time, the better quality the podcast. And that's your audience telling you they like that style of podcast. In your podcast description, add a call to action for new listeners to listen to a fan favorite episode. Remove the barrier to entry for someone who's just discovered your show, read your show description, and you pointed them in the right direction, saying a fan favorite episode. Because it adds a level of social proof and tells them, hey, my fans, our audience love this episode. I'm confident you will too. And that's an easy way to get them to do what? Engage with your podcast and listen to the show right away without them having paralysis by analysis, looking at your entire back catalog. You've made the decision easy for them. So this is where this was. So you see, this is meant to be way earlier, but you know what? When you're going crazy, you write all these tips down, you sometimes get a bit confused. So look at your highest retention time episodes, and that will tell you which episodes your audience absolutely adores. Release episodes on a consistent schedule to build a loyal audience. People love consistencies. Make the feeling of listening to your podcast on a weekly basis for your audience feel habitual. Sponsoring popular newsletters and podcasts within your niche is a great way to get the right exposure on your podcast, because let's face it, not all exposure are created equal. If I have a podcast about helping other podcasts growing called Why Podcast Isn't Growing, and I sponsor just a random newsletter that has a general show, that doesn't really mean much, right? But if I sponsor a newsletter that's, let's say, all about podcasting news or helping podcasters when it comes to production, there's an overlap there. Our audiences overlap, but there's not a conflict of interest. So sponsoring newsletters within your industry is a great way to get in front of your ideal listeners, the actual listeners you want to reach. And yes, this might cost you a bit of money, but I would honestly say it's absolutely worth the investment and is worth experimenting with. Because let's say, for example, you know that your show is super specific, it's super clear who it's for, and you have a powerful content strategy that gets listeners binging your content. All you need to then do to grow your podcast is simply get more exposure. How you get that exposure doesn't really matter. If it means you're investing $100, $250, $500 a month to get the right exposure in front of the right listeners, Why wouldn't you do that? It's a great way to get in front of the audience you want to reach. If you're editing your podcast yourself, use Descript, as it allows you to edit through transcripts. Edit in 2x speed to cut your editing time in half. Descript is a phenomenal AI software that you can use to edit your podcast. I'd absolutely recommend looking into it. It's such an easy way to edit your podcast and create high quality sounding shows. Editing to X speed is just a game changer. Like, why wouldn't you do that? You can't do it on just editing the normal audio files, but when you're editing through text, it's so much easier because you can follow the transcript along and you can make edits way faster. Use UGC, user generated content, is a great way to get your listeners to engage with you on your podcast. What do I mean? User generated content. An example that I can give is on our podcast, we invite listeners onto our show and we give them a live podcast audit / roaster show. The branding of roaster show is just way more attractive, sounds a bit sexier. It's exciting for our listeners, but it's not so exciting for the guests we have on. Anyways, the point is we're inviting our community members onto our podcast and they get to interact with myself and my business partner. It's an opportunity where my audience are engaging with me directly. So for you, it might be getting your audience to ask you specific questions or finding online communities where potential listeners might be and asking them on their thoughts on a particular episode. The point is you're going to leverage the content or the feedback you get from your audience and use it and incorporate it into your actual podcast to create a sense of community and have your listeners consistently engaging with you. If you have a popular guest on your show, find online communities / fan pages and start a question competition. Now, what the hell is a question competition, you ask? This is the best way that we've found to leverage high-profile guest names, even if they don't promote your podcast, right? Because a lot of the times you might have a high-profile guest on, you think it's going to be massive, you release episode, and it just performs like mediocre or just, average at best, right? Which isn't great for your morale or your motivation, or it's just a bit of a crap experience in general. Or the guests themselves, they might not promote the episode, which also is equally frustrating. But how can you take more control? And this is a great way to do that. Let's say, for example, you had someone like Tim Ferriss on your podcast. You can find specific Facebook groups or online communities where you feel like there's going to be a high concentration of Tim Ferriss fans. And it could be Facebook groups, it could be Twitter spaces, whatever that might be. You want to go into those communities and let them know that you have Tim Ferriss coming on your show and the interview is due in, let's say, 5 days. You then want to pose a competition and you say, hey, I have X big name on, Tim Ferriss. I'm going to be interviewing Tim Ferriss in 5 days. I would love this community to give me input on one specific questions I should ask. The top 3 questions with the highest number of engagements and likes is what I will ask Tim Ferriss. Now, this is such an easy way to, number 1, build awareness about your episode that's going to air with Tim Ferriss or the big name. Number 2 is a great way to create competitions. So now everyone's going to want to engage because the prize is their questions being asked. Number 3, because you've created a competition, it means other people who might not have questions, but who are interested in the topic will now go onto the post, like a bunch of different comments that they want you to ask Tim Ferriss. And in doing so, your post is now getting tons of people engaging, liking, commenting, going back and forth. And you create this positive feedback loop that gets picked up by the algorithm. So now that post gets shared to even more people. And it creates, again, another feedback loop where the more people see it, the more people engage. The more people engage, the more people see it. And then when you release the episode, you can simply tag every single person who engaged and let them know the episode is live and then announce the winner of the competition, letting people know the specific segment in the minutes within the episode that you asked the question. Bloody hell, that was a long-ass tip. I don't know if that was a tip or if that was a guide. But hey, it was all about giving value. So I hope you enjoy that one. It's easier to grow your podcast when you're targeting an audience who have a burning problem they want to solve or a deep desire. It's as simple as that. People are incentivized to take action when they have a problem they want to solve or a burning desire. If your podcast is super general, just an interview-based show for entrepreneurs, it's overdone, people aren't in enough pain, you're much better trying to solve a specific problem for that demographic. So if your audience are entrepreneurs, ask yourself, what's a burning pain point for a lot of entrepreneurs? And maybe you realize actually lead generation and marketing is something that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with. Cool. Then make your podcast super specific to begin with to solve that burning problem or that deep desire. So for you, whatever industry you're in, think about what's a burning problem people are facing and how can you position your podcast as the best podcast that helps your audience solve that specific problem. That is how you're going to gain traction fast, turn more strangers to listeners, and get those listeners coming back for more, because guess what? You're solving a burning problem that they have. Don't use your current situation to gauge how much time or effort you should invest into your podcast. Take action as if you're guaranteed to hit 100,000 downloads per month. This is so important because it's so easy to get disheartened, frustrated, annoyed, pissed off when your show isn't growing as fast as you want. But in doing so, when you get frustrated and maybe demotivated, then you take less action to try and grow your show. Oh, guess what? Now you're taking less action, so your podcast inevitably slows down. Your engagement rate also reduces, and you create a negative feedback loop. And you're now investing the time or effort into your show based on where you are right now. But if you knew that you were guaranteed to get 100,000 monthly downloads, well, the actions you take today change. You are going to be more ballsy. You are going to invest more into your podcast. You are going to actually apply a lot more strategy. You are going to prioritize the podcast way more because the outcome is guaranteed, right? So almost, if you imagine that there is a future where you are getting 100,000 monthly downloads, just imagine that, like just imagine it, right? And if that is the case, why don't we just act in alignment with that character, with the person who's going to achieve that goal? Because if you're demotivated, not taking action, well, how the hell are you going to reach the goal that you want? You won't. So really, really, really think about it. If you're trying to get into shape, you have to become the person who's already in shape and then start taking action as if you were that person already. And I'm getting a bit abstract and woo-woo here. But the point is, take relentless action towards your goal and try not to get demotivated along the way and just keep pushing forward, because it can happen if you just keep at it. Start each show notes with a powerful hook and end with a powerful call to action. Your show notes should be a sales pitch for your podcast episode. Starting with a strong hook grabs the attention of your ideal listeners and gets them to read the body and convinces them of why they should listen. And then you end it off with a powerful call to action that tells them exactly what they're going to gain or what they're going to miss out on by not listening to the podcast episode. The reason why listeners might not be engaging with your calls to action when you say it at the end of the episode is because they might not be hearing it. What do I mean? Let's say you get an average 100 downloads per episode and you keep giving the same call to action. Hey, join my program, join my course, and no one's taking it. It's really important that you actually analyze, is it because the call to action itself is terrible or because they just aren't hearing the call to action? We had a client recently who had this exact same scenario where he was getting around 100 downloads, kept giving the CTA, but no one would ever take it, which is annoying for him, right? So we looked at his retention time and we realized that on average, people listen to 60% of his episode. So they weren't even getting to the end of the episode in order to hear the call to action. Therefore, it was not about his call to action. It was the fact that his retention time was really low. So that changed our approach. We didn't focus on fixing the call to action. We focused on increasing his retention time to above 80, 90%. Once he did that consistently over a prolonged period of time, we found that way more of his listeners were getting to the end of his episodes and also taking his calls to action. Always give a singular incentive-based call to action. Do not confuse your audience. Make it clear, make it specific exactly what you want them to do. And it needs to be an incentive-based, meaning you have to tell them what they will gain by taking the action or what they will lose by not taking action, you know? And you can use urgency if you want. Hey, I'm going to be giving out a free copy of my best-selling book, Podcast Marketing, and it's going to be around for the next week. So if you want that, if you want to gain the insights completely for free, I normally charge $11 for this. I'll go there right now because I'm giving it away for free for the next 7 days. That's just an example for you. Think about what you could do for your show. Data-driven podcast SEO has nothing to do with websites or blogs, and has everything to do with ranking your show higher on Apple and Spotify. Those are the main platforms your audience go to discover new shows to listen to. So when you're able to rank higher on these platforms, guess what? You're being found. But if you're optimizing your website, your blogs, and all these different malarkey stuff, right? You're only attracting readers. When was the last time you went to, let's say, Google to discover a new podcast? It doesn't really happen, right? So don't get confused. Data-driven podcast SEO is all about podcast SEO. Focusing on Apple and Spotify. Pod swaps are a great way to collaborate with other podcasters for cross promotion. Pod swaps means you giving an ad read for someone else's podcast on your podcast. So sharing a new podcast to your audience and them doing the same for you. So on their podcast, they're going to be promoting your podcast. And it's going to be a 30-second ad read. And it's an easy way for you guys to cross promote. Your podcast get exposed to a new audience and your audience gets exposed to a new podcast. It's a win-win and a fantastic way to collaborate with other podcasters in your industry. Add 3 open loop hooks if your podcast episode is longer than 20 minutes to increase the engagement on your episode. Open loop hooks are essentially 3 benefits you state at the start of your podcast episode, if it's a longer show, incentivizing, giving your audience a reason why they should listen. You want to make this super intriguing, and by making them intriguing, your audience have to close the loop on the intrigue. They have to scratch their itch by listening through to the end. This is how you increase your listen time. Use SEO-friendly titles to improve the discoverability of your podcast on Apple and Spotify. How to do this? Well, simply at the end of each episode, ask yourself, what are 3 main keywords my audience will search in to discover this specific podcast? Maybe you guys focus in on, let's say your podcast is all about business. Maybe you focus in on work-life balance. Maybe you focus in on lead generation, and you focus in on mental health. So those 3 keywords should be the keywords you then try to rank for. Have them and incorporate them in your episode titles in order to rank for the right terms. You're essentially giving data to Apple and Spotify, letting them know which keywords they should rank your show for. The more data you give them, the search term, the keywords, the better it is when it comes to you being more discovered by people searching in those specific keywords that you have in your titles on Apple and Spotify. Tease upcoming content at the end of episodes to keep listeners excited for future podcasts. Use platforms like YouTube, Google, and other platforms to validate episode ideas. Let's say you're thinking about future topics to cover on your podcast. Just go on YouTube, go on Google, see what's popular, see what's trending in the industry right now. Look at the titles, use that framework, make it your own, don't be a copycat. However, this is an easy way to validate ideas that you have and ask yourself, are there other people who've done this and have they found success? If they have, great. You can go through and record the episode because you validated this is something your audience actually want. But if not, you're essentially just guessing, hoping that people are actually going to be interested in the topic you cover. And it doesn't really allow you to reach a new audience who are searching for those popular topics. The goal of your podcast content is to attract a new audience base and keep listeners coming back for more. Focus on serving listeners the best that you can, and everything becomes 10 times easier. Don't hold back information, give freely, show some love to your audience, give them the most amount of value you possibly can in an episode, and that will honestly make everything so much easier because your conviction, the love that you pour into the podcast is a transfer of energy, right? Because, for example, if you listen to a show and you tell people are super passionate, they're super enthusiastic, they generally care about the podcast, you're far more likely to return back to it because you can feel the energy. And again, not to get too woo-y, but it's true, right? We gravitate to an energy. We get addicted to specific creators because they make us feel a particular way. So by you just focusing on serving your audience the best you possibly can, you're going to create the same feelings and emotions to your audience. And that's what's going to keep them hooked on your podcast. Keep your interviews focused and cut out any fluff or side quest post episode. That's meant to say post-production. So once you've interviewed a guest and you realize there's a bunch of fluff, a bunch of nonsense, and you went on too many segues and it wasn't too focused, just cut it out post-edit, clean things up for yourself, and make sure that the pacing of the episode feels natural and it feels like things are moving on nicely. You're not going on too many segues, but it's actually a focused conversation. Like, again, when you're not a massive show and you're just building your core audience, it's really important that the product itself is really tight-knit and well executed on. Track the numbers of downloads you get within 72 hours of release to track your growth rate. So each time you release a new episode, just track, okay, within 3 days, how many downloads on average am I getting? And then track that over months. So after 3 months, that number, if you would get, let's say, getting 100 downloads per episode, that number after a month or 2 months, if you're applying specific growth strategies, that number should increase naturally. So if you get 100 downloads after 3 days, that should then go up to, let's say, 120, and then 150, and then 180. The point is, that should gradually grow up, and that's a much better representation of your growth rate over your monthly downloads. Track unique listeners per day to track the performance of a new growth strategy. So if you're going to experiment with a new growth strategy, for example, sponsoring a newsletter or a pod swap or promoting on social media, just ask yourself, okay, this promotional piece that I'm now doing, this newsletter I'm now sponsoring, once it's gone live, does my unique listenership increase significantly for that day, right? So if you had a episode that was launched on, let's say, on the 20th of the month, and then you know that on average, you have a unique listener count for each day of like 100. And on the 20th, the day when the newsletter was sponsored, you get 150. So that's 50 more people, unique listeners, viewed your podcast. That's a clear indication that that strategy is working and you should double down. So again, it's just tracking your metrics and not just hoping things will happen, but understanding like the clear cause and effect of the actions you're taking when it comes to growing your podcast. I take X action, sponsor a newsletter, and I see significant growth in my unique listenership for that day. Use dynamic ads to monetize without disrupting the listener experience. Plus, backdate old episodes when you have something to promote. So let's say you have a launch coming up for a program or an offer, whatever it might be. Backdate a bunch of your old episodes, because guess what? Your audience are most likely going to go back and consume previous content. If your content is good and engaging, people will go back and just binge your content. I know that I do that with specific podcasts that I genuinely really enjoy. So for you, if you have something you want to promote, then go back and add specific ads if you have something you're promoting. This way, you increase awareness of the particular promotion and you get the most amount of your listeners to engage with the promotion. Actively engage with your communities through Q&A sessions or live events. Invest in good equipment and software for high quality podcast production. Honestly, I'd say maybe every 6 months to a year, think about your audio, think about your actual kit. People listen to your podcast and listen to you talk to them. It's really important that you're constantly leveling up your actual equipment that you use, because again, it's a reflection of the quality of your show overall. It's a bloody podcast, so it needs to sound nice. Use Descript Studio Sound if your guest has a bad audio quality. Studio Sound is a little feature on Descript, which is an editing software that podcasters use that allows for incredible sounding audio quality. So let's say, for example, you have a guest who did a really good job in terms of the interview and the podcast itself. However, the guest audio quality might be a bit muffled or might sound a bit tinny or not sound as crisp. Adding studio sound is a great way to quickly, using AI, clean up the entire sound of your podcast. And honestly, this feature is basically magic. I can't lie. It literally feels like magic when you use studio sound. Stay up to date with industry trends and adapt your strategy accordingly. Look, make sure your podcast is timely. Make sure that you are looking with the industry. Make sure the content you're producing feels super relevant to where your audience are right now. And if there's massive shifts and massive changes that you might foresee, maybe think about changing your positioning, changing your show name. The topics you might cover on the podcast might pivot to cater for the timely content. Always include an incentive-based call to action at the end of each episode. Tell your listeners what they will gain and tell your listeners what they will lose by not taking action. Your show description should be solely focused on what your listeners will gain from your podcast. So again, think about it. Your show description is a sales pitch for your podcast. It's not about you and how great you are and your credentials. It's not about the topics you're going to cover on the podcast. It's about how the specific podcast, who it's for, why they should listen, how their lives will improve, and why they can't afford not to listen. I guess those are the same things, right? But you get the point. The focus needs to be on the specific listener. And I didn't know this, but a lot of people look at podcast show descriptions. And it's funny and ironic because it's the thing that I feel like everyone kind of like, myself included, you kind of set and forget your show description. You forget about it, right? But it's so important that you recognize that that's also the story point for a new listener. If they check out your podcast, they like the episode, like the cover, and they look at your description, it's your job to then sell them on the episode overall. So use your show description as a sales pitch and focus all on the value your audience will gain. Buying specific Facebook groups is a great way to promote your podcast to new audiences. We had one of our clients recently, we helped purchase a Facebook group. He's in the teaching space. He found a Facebook group that made sense. I think it was around 2,000 members, and he just purchased the group because a lot of people have Facebook groups that they started years ago that they can no longer keep up because they don't want to maintain it, and maybe they just lost interest. So finding these smaller groups or bigger groups, if they're in the thousands, where the admin members are less active, but they have a big engaged audience, and then reaching out to the admin members and simply just saying, hey, look, I'm interested in buying your group. Are you open to something like this? Honestly, more often than not, they are open to it and it will surprise you. So make sure to give that a good go. Buying those groups allows you to, again, tap into an audience that already exists, but don't know about your podcast yet, and allows you to freely promote to a new audience who haven't heard of your show. So just set aside some budget, maybe from $250 to $500 in order to invest in buying a group, a Facebook group or multiple Facebook groups where your audience are hanging out. And last but not least, don't hire a social media manager unless you have a proven and reliable process to turn strangers online into listeners. Look, it's so easy to get carried away thinking a social media manager or a VA is going to come in, promote a bunch of your stuff, create promotional content, and it's going to blow up your show. That rarely ever happens. unless you have a reliable way to use social media to attract, to turn your followers into actual listeners, there's no point hiring someone for that role. It doesn't make sense. But if you do have a proven strategy, it's the perfect thing you should do because it allows you to delegate the growth of your podcast, allowing someone else to come in and manage a system that you yourself have already created. So look, my name is Anthony Waneri. You have been absolutely fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed this. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't expecting it to take so long, but apparently it did. But I hope you got a ton of value from it. And please, I don't make these videos just for fun. So do take action. And of course, leave a like down below if you enjoyed this. And let me know what your favorite tip was. I just broke my rule there, but hey, yo.